Great, thanks everyone for jumping on. As folks are joining, just a couple housekeeping items. For those who don't know me, my name is Morgan Beltz. I'm a Government Affairs Associate here at Oregon Business and Industry. Today we've got a great panel for you with members from the Department of Education. Please, this is a webinar. I'm sure we won't go for the full 90 minutes, but we are slated until 5:30, but we'll close as we need to. For those who have questions during the panel, please use the Q&A function, and I will be monitoring questions throughout the webinar, so chime in whenever you'd like. Lastly, we are recording this webinar, so we will be putting it up on our website after, and we will have follow-up materials from the ODE staff that we can send out to those who participated. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott Nine from the Department of Education, who will introduce himself and his team. Scott, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Morgan. It's good to be with everybody. Thanks everyone for taking the time to be with us, and welcome as well if you're listening to a recording later. We will hope to make good use of your time. I'm an assistant superintendent at ODE for the Office of Education, Innovation, and Improvement, and the primary focus of this webinar is going to be about some parts of implementation of the Student Success Act, which we'll get into. But I'm joined by a couple of great teammates from ODE who are going to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll basically be around in case there are specific questions, as well as to listen in to the presentation. And so we'll do a little pass around. So first, members of our legislative team. Zoe, would you go first?
Hi, my name is Zoe Larmer. I am the Director of the Government Relations and External Affairs team for ODE. And joining me is my colleague, Nicole, who's also part of the Ledge team.
Hey everyone, Nicole Peterson. I am Legislative Coordinator for ODE. Thanks for having us.
Great. And then joined by my colleague, the new Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Finance, Information, and Technology, Kai Turner.
Hi, Kai Turner. I was introduced as the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Information Technology. So all of those back of the office functions for ODE is within my wheelhouse. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Kai. And Tamara?
Good afternoon. I'm Tamara Dykman. I was hired about 3 years ago to help with the implementation of the Student Success Act, and I'm a policy advisor.
And with that, hopefully you can see my screen okay. And going to jump in. So this is in some ways a follow-up to a presentation in April of a year ago. We had a chance to present to this group about some of the aspects of Student Success Act implementation, and had been wanting to kind of come back and what I'm calling here an implementation tour, which is to kind of get under the hood a little bit around what it actually looks like to implement these programs at scale and give you some of that rich detail. The real hope I have for that is that sometimes we think about the really big picture. We tend not to actually spend enough time, in my opinion, talking about the execution. And for, as all of you are business leaders, hopefully you can appreciate that the details really do matter. There's a quote here from Michael Fullen, who's a highly regarded educational change theorist, about a real simple way to think about it is implementations really, does it get put in place or not? And sometimes we focus on kind of high level surface things. And so today I'm really hoping to get into the deep details. And so what that looks like. I'm going to do a little bit of just put this presentation in context, because context really can matter. And then give you that detailed tour. So we're going to look at a timeline of implementation in the office that I lead, look at some of the systems, processes, and challenges that we're using to support implementation, give you an overview of a really big event within the implementation of the Student Investment Account and high school success called Integrated Guidance, give you a little picture of what we know about how SIA resources are being used by districts so far, and then cover some last insights around thinking about monitoring and performance and how we think about impact as it relates to the work in the office. Morgan has agreed to monitor the chat, and I've given her permission to interrupt me if it's within the flow of things, so it can feel a little bit more dialogue-ish. And so I welcome that, and we also will leave time for conversation at the end. All right, so some context. The first piece, and I will put a link to this in the chat as well, is that the Student Success Act is 28 investments. And what's linked here and in the slide deck as well that you'll get in follow-up, it'll link to this one pager, is a summary of all 28 of those investments updated for their 21-23 biennium dollars. The Student Success Act ensures that there's at least 20% of the corporate activity tax after a small percentage gets pulled out to the state school fund as a transfer, goes to early learning account, at least 50% to the student investment account, and up to 30% to something called the statewide education initiatives account. Again, implementation of those accounts feeds 28 different programs. And sometimes in the media or in other places, we're conflating the student investment account, which is a not unimportant and significant driver of system change, with the totality of those 28 programs. And so just want to clarify that from the jump. Today we'll primarily be focused on the student investment account running alongside other programs in the Office of Education, Innovation, and Improvement for some specific reasons. The office was established with the passage of the Student Success Act and given several responsibilities within ODE's overall architecture. I won't read all these to you, but it's worth noting that one of the key ideas from the legislature and from field leaders was to see if, as the agency would implement the student investment account, could it connect or align that work with the federal school improvement work, often referred to as ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and our responsibilities under IDEA, High School Success, and Perkins CTE investments across the offices, as well as to monitor innovations and thinking about educational change across the US and internationally. That's not an insignificant set of responsibilities. There was also a budget note. Most of you are probably aware, but when a bill passes, you have the legislative concept side, but often a budget bill. In the budget bill, there was an even more formal expectation that we try to look at any ways to align or connect. And that will make sense as we go through the presentation, I hope, to you about why we've done some of the things that we've done in terms of implementation. I will keep coming back to this idea of this is a small part of a much bigger puzzle. So I feel fairly proud of the work. There's a lot to do and a lot still to be done. But I feel proud of the work that we're doing in what we call EII. And the 6 programs that we're responsible for, but they are a small picture within the 108 state and federal programs that ODE administers. Also, just in terms of context, a little quick history about school accountability, because it matters a lot when we think about how we are trying to implement the student investment account and some of the other initiatives in EII. As a reminder, the federal role really begins in 1965 with the passage of what is really civil rights legislation, the passage of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. That federal backbone law gets reauthorized in theory every 7 years, in practice much like every 14 or 20 years. You're probably most familiar with something called No Child Left Behind. It is currently ESSA. But it's an important fundamental understanding, the idea that states work in concert with the federal government have a responsibility for students experiencing poverty. In 1975, IDEA joined that function around thinking about poverty as we begin to focus on responsibilities for students with disabilities. The Nation at Risk, a report in the 1980s, made a significant shift in people's thoughts. There was an alarm bell rang that we were essentially educationally losing to other countries. Lots of different ideas about what would drive educational change and fairness across the country. I've broadly crafted an era of standards-based reform where states and the federal government were very much about using standards to say, we'll set what the standard should be and look for districts to meet that standard. What shifted with the passage of No Child Left Behind was the idea that those weren't just optional standards, but there would actually be test-based accountability, disaggregated data, and a much more competitive framework Near the end of that, you have the origins of something called Race to the Top, lots of pressure and incentives, some of which worked and some of which many people would argue were kind of perverse incentives, or actually the right idea of what you're trying to cause, but maybe they didn't play out in the system the way that people hoped. The passage of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, not to get confused with our own Student Success Act, although the words are very similar, was focused on actually relocating much more control at the state and local level. Much of our educational field still lives on a kind of no child left behind framework. Many educators were trained during that time, but there's actually significant room for local and state responsibility and opportunities for a lot of innovation. And then obviously in 2019, we passed the Student Success Act in Oregon, which brought significant additional revenue, but also its own kind of set of ideas about what would drive change in the educational system. Much more of a capacity building framework with lots of prescriptive requirements for what districts have to do in their planning, but quite a bit of freedom in terms of where they spend the funds. And I'll take you through that in more detail, but just thought a little quick high level context would help. This visual is connected to that. This is work, and in the end of the presentation, I'll provide a link to research and links to some of these things. But this comes from the Learning Policy Institute, and it's work that they've done around accountability systems and what was learned from all of that time until really this was all, most of this work was published in 2017, 18, 19. One of the key findings of the Learning Policy Institute's work is that good laws don't immediately equate to change practice. And that while you can pass a law, does it actually get into the implementation of changing what adults do in buildings and change students' experiences, and what types of things need to be in place in order to cause that change to happen, with a real focus on how to build capacity in systems with the same intensity of what was previously test-based accountability systems. This slide just gives you a visual of all the people that are a part of causing these changes to unfold in the system. ODE is a part of a much larger educational system. Obviously, you are all part of a much larger total community, and we need everyone in that picture in order to be able to make these changes. I thought also helpful to just give you a quick look at where we are in terms of the students that we're serving. You can see 200 languages spoken. You can see where we're at in terms of diversity of the educator workforce, where student diversity is rapidly changing, and the size of districts and ESDs and so forth. You'll also note the little asterisk on students, because that number was higher, almost 20,000 students higher in the prior biennium. And those students didn't disappear. They left public K-12 settings. Lots of questions about whether they'll come back, where and how, what's unfolded. And then there are also many thousands of students who are in private settings. But that gives you a little glimpse of what we're talking about in total. Last context slide. I understand from Morgan that many of you paid attention to the Secretary of State's recent advisory report. Several findings there, and our office was called out in that report in several ways in terms of work that we're doing, and I hope to get you a little deeper into. That report's important. It names a number of areas that are essential for the governor and the legislature and really all of you to understand about what it will take to be able to build off of work we've done for the last couple of years and be able to keep that moving. One thing that's called out in that report, and I'll put in the chat, is a recent student investment account update that as you have time, I encourage you to go get into the detail of, because it is an example of us providing a more robust report about program implementation, including challenges with implementation. The one thing that I think gets a little lost in the coverage of the Secretary of State's advisory report is using the language of risk for a general public that doesn't speak auditor makes it sound like something problematic is happening, when what I believe they're really trying to say is, we've made a big bet. We're early in the implementation of that big bet. And there are a lot of things we need to do to care for that investment so that we see it through. And much of the rest of my presentation is really helping give you a much clearer sense of all the work that goes into that and to help inform thoughts about where we need to head next. So this is the beginning of the Under the Hood implementation tour. This slide could take up all the rest of our time. And welcome you to spend time with it or ask questions about it, but I'm gonna give you a high flying tour through it just in terms of sequence, and then give you some examples of some of the processes we're using. So I got hired in late August. My first day at ODE was September 9th, 2019. Soon after my arrival, ODE reorganized itself, something that hadn't been done in a very long time, to try to rebalance and design for the passage of this law. That's a huge shift for a state agency to make. This is all pre-pandemic, but lots of trying to think through how to get these school improvement efforts to situate alongside each other, which meant reassigning personnel, which means lots of changes in state architecture, business processes, workforce tools. While that was all going on, we launched the Community Engagement Toolkit and the guidance for districts and taught statewide what had been passed in the student investment account specifically. We did all the rulemaking related to that, which there was lots of places where the law was passed with a need for additional rules in order to execute and fill in details. And then we made a key hiring decision in my office to create a position called relational strategist, whose charge is to move across the teams in the new office and build the connections and patterns to allow for some of what you'll see, hopefully, in what we've been able to accomplish in the last couple of years. Springtime, we had our first round of SIA applications submitted. We had all but 3 districts in the state who are eligible apply. It was a huge success. We were, the little pandemic symbol here is those things were heavily impacted by COVID. We had to pause our application process. We were frozen by the legislature, both in terms of lack of clarity of what resources would come, as well as staff hiring at that time. But we continued to do work in the office. So we worked hard at the high school success program and helping implement it to fidelity and get much clearer about expectations for that investment. We built an office vision and we identified the impediments for why these multiple programs that live in the office, which you'll hear more about, why they were not moving in alignment with each other. That summer, we worked through budget questions. Most of the staff in the office had not had clear access and information about internal budgets, lots of work on procedures and architecture that needed to be in place. We again finally got clarity that August about special session impact. So the budget for all districts for the SIA was reduced to $150 million. And some positions were permanently held. They've been unlocked now, but there was still a lot of pause in the system. Again, we used that time to deep strategy work in the office. We got clear that we needed to build data tools and processes. Again, I'll talk more about this, but we identified that there were not internal data tools. We had like high-level data around things like 9th grade on track, graduation, but internal data systems around what districts submit to ODE, how we would review applications. None of those tools were shared in a common way across the agency and had to make significant investments and make a lot of operational moves to build architecture that hadn't been in place. We had to train and build internal review processes and help support districts with implementation given the kind of changing climate. By winter, we had solidified position descriptions for all staff. And all staff getting performance reviews. We had built data review protocols and infrastructure. We navigated COVID and ESSER federal funds. In the springtime, we launched data tools and dashboards across the whole office, the fruit of that work I just mentioned. We got much deeper into budgeting cycles and processes. We mapped out the entire biennial calendar in terms of districts related to these 6 programs. And we crafted and landed a 2-year operational plan for this new office. Summer, fall 21, not that long ago, we deployed tools to education service districts. There are 19 of them in Oregon. They're like intermediary bodies that support our 197 districts. They support us to provide a regionalized relational support to districts. We're able to create a dynamic data view where they could see and share the tools we're looking at. We are able to build budget dashboards that offer similar support. And then we worked on and then launched what we'll spend a lot more time on, this integrated guidance. At the same time, we met our responsibilities to demonstrate good faith in the 5th year of implementation of high school success and provided corrective action plans to 17 districts across the state. And we also aligned all of our communications in the office. That's the fast version. I'm a big believer in thinking about execution as people, strategy, and operations. And while that flyby's there, I'm going to kind of drop into some of the details of what I just covered a little more slowly. So a lot of rapid learning on arrival. I mentioned already, no internal data systems. We had to build grant management software. The agency does a very good job with the basic budget mechanics. Kai's here, his team handles lots of the ins and outs of how we basically handle moving funds to districts. That's less what I'm talking about here and more about the management of those agreements and how we track the important evaluation impact data, relational touch points that we needed to build. The field, the districts had a lot of confusion. There's already a federal school improvement framework. High school success had had several years. Very happy for the resources for the student investment account. But in the previous efforts, each of those teams were brought to ODE as separate, distinct teams, running their own plans and processes with their own evaluation frameworks, with their own submission processes, and no cross communication between them. In joining together, we essentially had to face that just amongst the 6 programs, not even the fullness of 108. How could we learn what each of these initiatives were trying to accomplish and try to make them more coherent to give each of them a shot at actually causing the kinds of changes that everyone in Oregon is hoping for out of this effort? Decided to take a phased approach with initial focus on SIA excellence, but then build that alignment in the office over time. I'm happy to share more about that. And really focus on barriers to effectiveness and thinking about how we build these partnerships in regions. Our implementation strategy, a lot more to this, but just as a brief set of things, is thinking about how we build trust. I understood that there was a lot of historic frustration from school leaders about a clear sense of purpose, execution, follow-up, follow-through that could come at ODE, and that we could gain a lot of yield out in the field by being excellent in those details, and that we really need to be clear on purpose, focus on helping educators in the field learn, back to that capacity building idea that I mentioned from Learning Policy Institute. But we also couldn't give away our responsibility. The state has a fundamental accountability role. I like to translate accountability as integrity. And we needed to be clear about where we are providing what I call the right amount of challenge and the right amount of support. We need to be able to make iterations, make mistakes, recover, avoid as much clutter, but also design implementation so we aren't building for the lowest common denominator, most fearful, fragile, cynical people, but really with deep purpose about what could be accomplished across the state over time. This slide's just a quick artifact of the ways in which that early SI rollout happened and a reminder of what that program does in terms of process requirements. And more beautiful, here is just a very small taste of hundreds of artifacts that we have from across the state of the ways that Oregonians gathered to weigh in on that initial set of funds. There's a lot that we should celebrate about that. A lot of deepening use of better tools to engage community, good use of an equity lens, better planning. It's unfortunate that a lot of that got lost in the COVID pandemic in terms of people's ability to track in that all had played out. And in a way that we've named to the legislature, the cutting of the funds in that moment, while understandable from a total legislative budget standpoint, didn't really help us at a moment where we just engaged significant community folks who put their dreams forward and then had to face reductions in money at a time of a pandemic. I think we've done a good job trying to partner with community-based organizations and districts and to talk with families about those impacts. Very happy that the resources are back and in full at this point in time, but it was a tough kind of out of the gate phenomenon to do a big launch and then have it kind of immobilized, held and reduced at that time. That said, one of the upsides of those pain points is it let us do a lot of these deeper system design pieces of work. So we tried to make the most of that situation. This is a snapshot just to give you a flavor of the type of internal work needed to build system architecture so that we actually are reviewing every district's application. We trained 40 reviewers across ODE offices, building tools and criteria to help us know how to review applications and ensure that we're meeting all the different requirements. I mentioned building data tools and dashboards. This is an example of a dashboard we've built for every single district in Oregon that pulls information out of high school success, student investment account, what we have in the larger kind of state data architecture around things like third grade reading, pulls contact information and gives my staff at their fingertips information to be able to know exactly what's happening with the districts that they're responsible to support, as well as a communications log so we can track flows. Morgan, I see you.
Hi, Scott. I'm just curious, is this public for people to see, to send out, or is it just for internal ODE use?
It is at this time fully internal, especially it's got things like internal communications tracking. So something that, didn't exist previously is, one staff member goes and calls a district superintendent or a business manager, curriculum instruction, and another person's going to talk to them. There was no way that people knew communication flow, but that's not, technically everything's a public record. So we could download it and share it, but it's been built for internal tools to help us be good at support. There are versions of this that could be made public, although we could talk about some of the barriers. We're allowed to do some things internally that we're not allowed to do externally. So there are very high, significant rules around visualization of data to meet public accessibility requirements by the federal government. And some of the kinds of things that we can do internally, we're not yet able to do externally on a website. So it's a longer conversation around some of the limitations of that. But
great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in. Okay, that I should say that almost everything that is in these tools is available publicly. So even though we're pulling it together in a way that sees a richer picture, the student investment account applications are posted on the website and public by every district and on ODE's page. The third grade reading metrics, all the data, but what's here, and I understand why people would be interested, is to kind of pull all the pieces together. I mentioned the operational plan and the timeline. Again, I won't read all of this detail to you, but we were doing a lot of internal work on that execution side of how do we operate the promise of building the way that these plans need to situate with each other in a way that can deliver. And so we had to rethink how we organize staffing at the department. We had to get really clear about the purposes of each program. We'd made a commitment that we would move towards what I'll present to you around integrated guidance. And we had to tighten up our overall kind of operations tools and processes. In total, we're allocating now with full funding for the SIA back 1.295 billion in resources this biennium. That's roughly about 10% of the total amount of funds that goes to districts, the state school fund being the larger driver of that. We're servicing 197 districts, 318 high school success recipients, and the 19 ESDs. I mentioned the work around high school success implementation, as well as our work on the Everyday Matters initiative, which is focused on chronic absenteeism, which was previously treated as a kind of siloed effort. And we have now redesigned it to scale through these bigger programs, which will make it have a much bigger impact, given that it's a small dollar program. This is for your review of slides later, but just a glimpse of the overall ODE org chart and to get a sense of the totality of the office and the work we're doing. This is just a quick snapshot of our EII org chart. We have gone literally from our first 2 staff members to 20 staff members to now where we just hired our 51st person and we're soon approaching 53. That's a lot of hiring through a pandemic, lots of onboarding, lots of team building, lots of training, lots of structure, lots of talent that we brought to the state to implement these programs. So I mentioned these funny words, home team and capacity team, but what we realized is that in order to get these initiatives to work together, we had to cross-train our office for these 6 programs to actually be able to understand them and then build a relationship and regional design for implementation. And so while we formally are in home teams from an HR perspective, from a budget perspective, we have built teams cross-connecting staff for core functions of leading for these efforts. And then we have built out team structures so that we're tied to servicing each region in a way where staff can get to know regionally their counterparts in ESDs and work from a more regional design. And so more fully developed, that looks like regional support, educational experts in these initiatives, grant management support for all the back-end financial processes, and then ESD liaisons, so staff who are funded by ESDs to match up with us in region. And I know that was one of the concerns around SI implementation is could we get a more regional connection? I think we've done that in a very successful way. There are 19 ESDs. We've combined them into 8 regions from an internal process standpoint. But this is a significant bit of work in order to implement this. This is a quick bit of detail on the work to support those ESDs. So the SSA funds in that SEIA account, $41 million to ESDs. That is a significant and really critical investment. It's allowed us to build architecture with ESDs and really build up the skill to translate this into the hands of district leaders and communities with people that they know and they trust and have history with. And it's also given us a way to uptake information from each region around barriers and challenge and be much more skillful in listening about how to solve problems. We're also excited to be working with the ESDs to build a new set of rural and small school supports. It's going to use some federal ESSER COVID money, but really trying to do our work here. And now, as we move forward, we're also now mapping in with CTE regional coordinators, which gives us access to things that you all might care about in terms of workforce and sector data and beginning to brew those things in coordination together. Again, you can look at this later, but just gives you a flavor of how much resources going to ESDs in total. The gear yellow is that rural resource that I'm talking about. That's a new initiative to support our smallest and most rural school districts. Quick pause for a drink of water. It's 87 degrees in my house, which is also why I'm in a polo shirt. So hopefully everyone's doing okay and in a cooler spot than I am. So we have this clear mission as an office. We see that being able to implement the student investment account well means we have to implement these school improvement initiatives well. We get leadership from the state, from ODE, Colt, and Carmen to basically reorganize the agency for successful implementation. We've got a charge from the legislature. We get out in the field. There's kind of agreement at every turn that these things should be talking to each other. How do you actually pull that off? I've given you kind of a snapshot of the behind the scenes work, and now I'm going to take you through some of the much more above ground work that we've been able to pull off and launch, and we'll take you kind of into where we are in the present and going forward into the future. And that really starts with covering integrated guidance. I'll provide a link to a letter from Director Colt Gill that introduced this document. But what we were able to do amidst all of this is actually map out all the impediments, all the different issues in terms of statute and rules, and operationally align these 6 programs to be able to work together for districts and set up a foundation for some really robust engagement and planning coming this fall. In my opinion, right in the nick of time structurally, in the wake of everything COVID's revealed, to help each district and community think about what should the next 5 years in their community be about, and what will they do with this targeted array of resources, and how do they put them in relationship, those resources, to each other? What are they trying to cause and change? All in a way that we could make for less administrative burden for districts, but higher focus in terms of impact or outcomes. Those 6 programs are listed here. So high school success, the student investment account, continuous improvement planning, which is our responsibility under that federal ESSA law, career and technical education using Perkins, which is not in my office, but we've partnered really closely with OTLA and the CTE team. Everyday Matters on chronic absenteeism, and early indicator intervention systems, which is a pretty small dollar program, but is a building block to be able to implement high school success well. We released this in February. And again, I'll share several resources at the end of the slide deck so you can access all of this guidance and see what we've been doing. Again, we really want to make the right work easier. And we have at this point traveled across the state to all 19 ESDs. This is a pretty big set of guidance. We've printed with ESDs more than 2,000 copies that we've distributed across the state. We've held multiple half-day workshops with educators statewide, all preparing for implementing this work. So big launch of the guidance. Heading into this fall, all districts are required to go through new rounds of community engagement and needs assessment, pulling on what each of these laws call for, chance to go deep in their planning, apply an equity lens and looking at how they allocate resources, work through the process requirements of all of these initiatives, build a budget, build a plan, post the integrated application to the public, and then that comes to us for review. And then we review and then co-develop performance targets, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And that's this kind of core architecture or framework. This is like a window into everything that's in that guidance. And again, I'll take you on a quick flyby. We were able to do this because these initiatives have common elements, and we were focusing on 4 common goals that are also consistent with the state's federal ESSA plan. This long-term rhythm is important for you to understand on an operational standpoint. So when the legislature passed the SSA, they really wanted to map the continuous improvement process with the 4-year plan cycles already written and required for high school success and CTE implementation. And with this guidance, we've been able to accomplish that. So districts are now in a consistent rhythm where they essentially plan for 4 years out into the horizon. They deliver to ODE a 2-year plan of budget execution and use, and their narrative around what those things would accomplish. And then after a year of execution, they go through that ongoing community engagement planning process, revisit their assumptions, cast out again for the next 4 years, and then execute on the next 2. And that rhythm is now structurally built. This is a very big accomplishment in Oregon that is probably not well understood, but I think is now well understood by district leaders. We've not, I think, had something like this in place prior. This is a quick look at the application process, what districts need to go through in order to meet their integrated application responsibilities before the plan comes to ODE. There are a lot of requirements. And so while there's a lot of freedom for educator judgment and community input in what gets spent, there are high expectations and requirements around what's got to be done in order to do that. One of the bigger and more exciting developments is getting to one common framework for outcomes, strategies, and activities, which will then lead to a performance framework that is common, because you can't monitor evaluation and performance if everyone's using different words for goals and outcomes and indicators, and everyone's not on the same page. And so again, while this is only 6 of 108 programs, it's not an insignificant thing that we've gotten to a shared framework, a shared way to plan, one application, one budget tool, one needs assessment process for these 6 programs. I mentioned small school support, and just there's a lot of effort in the guidance to kind of call out details for the large number of small school districts that we have in the state. This is another snapshot of just looking at some of the core pieces of architecture. So what's the community saying, including students, including staff? How do we apply an equity lens and core practices? How do we do a good job with needs assessment and all that, looking to drive outcomes? A concept that we teach in the guidance is called targeted universalism. And when you get a chance, if you want to dive into the integrated guidance, you'll see a lot of detail and data where we've disaggregated data by different groups. But it's also important to talk about setting common universal goals. And so we're trying to teach a process to district leaders. And these laws just are really tailor-made to this idea of universal goals and specific targeted goals and how they work in concert to each other. That looks roughly like this visual. Establish a universal goal, assess general population, look at specific groups that are performing differently, assess and understand the details at those intersection points, and then develop targeted strategies for each group. And you need both of those things moving at the same time to cause change. We've also provided a robust community engagement toolkit. That's a couple of years in the making. We've worked with the best leaders across the country to develop something that other folks in other states point to as, I think, really like a gold star for a state to be trying to teach community engagement at the level that we are and the ways in which it could impact district planning. We're a long way from living into the dream of that, but we've come a long way in terms of getting clear on what we're aiming for. Also in the integrated guidance, we teach a concept called tiered planning and budgeting. And here you may also have great interest. Part of what we've seen is in the habits of districts looking at prior financial data is one, the state financial system, school finance works where districts tend to claim their expenses. They're expending all year long, but many districts wait to claim expenditures until near the end of the year. That can cause a misperception in terms of about how districts are utilizing resources. But we've also seen that often what districts will do is plan for a workforce, and then they can't locate that workforce, and they don't have a next set of good plans. And we then tend to buy equipment or devices and lower quality spending. And so what we're trying to do is really help teach districts into better, deeper planning. And so we call that tiered planning because what we want folks to do is still go for hiring the counselor, social worker, CTE teacher that they think is key to unlocking their plan. But what's the next strategy and the next strategy and the next strategy and the next investment and the next investment so that they can more rapidly move to those things as things move. And the state has not previously provided a tool set to help them do that in a more robust way. And so we've worked hard to help that happen. In the guidance and rolling forward, we're providing this common framework for this programs under the integrated guidance with a clear definition of outcome, strategy, and this will allow us to much more successfully analyze what districts are accomplishing over time in a framework that didn't previously exist. We are also really wanting to look at and be able to study skill around braiding and blending funding. Historically, folks have been very much about kind of what can I do with these dollars and less about what is my total good plan for implementation and effectiveness and how do these funds support that and how am I skillful around braiding and blending. And so again, a lot of work and capacity building around how to do that more successfully. So again, if you're interested in kind of how do schools get better, this is the detailed under the hood kind of stuff that is maybe not as fun to talk about, but is I think at the peak of like how we actually innovate on behalf of kids, because it's the conditions that allow for great things to unfold in the classroom and with kids. As districts complete all of that work, including their budget, they submit that to us. In that submission process, we go through a review process, and we will be calling on all of you if you're interested to be part of a review process where you get eyes on ODE's review of that work and can weigh in. Not so much to say, yes, I like this plan, or no, I don't like this plan, but more to say like, has ODE done a good job reviewing this process? But we'll be unfolding that late next spring. You'll certainly hear from us about that, but trying to practice a good kind of quality management review process at the state. And then, as I've mentioned, we're providing a ton of resource on this continuum of technical assistance to districts, professional learning, formal coaching programs, including those we require districts to participate in when we don't see them performing well, all the way to corrective action, where in the case of like high school success, I mentioned we've gone so far as to direct districts what they need to do with their resources in order to meet responsibilities under that program. That's a lot of information. One more drink of water. Almost through it into your questions. So one of the things that we knew that you might be interested in is just like, okay, that's interesting on implementation. Good to get a look. I hope that that's how you feel. And good to see a picture of the integrated guidance, but like, what have people done with the money so far? And so giving you a little bit of information about what we know from the first year of funding. Districts are just completing the annual report for their second year of funding, which is where we reconcile what they said they were going to do in their budget and what we accepted as their plan and what they actually spent on and their analysis. And so by October, November, we'll have a really good idea of what districts did with the very full funding of the second year of implementation of the SIA. But to give you a little sense of it, this is by allowable use. So there's categories in the SIA. They're actually fairly wide open in terms of what's allowed under them. But you can see that the significant amount of money went to, of the 150 million for the first year, primarily went to health and safety, but not an insignificant amount of money. This is in the millions of dollars. Went to reduce class size and well-rounded education, with less going to those other categories. Interesting to look by type of expenditure, very heavily spent on workforce and less so in other dimensions. And then what we saw in terms of when you break down that workforce, what do you see? And so you can see licensed teachers, educational assistants, a pretty significant number of counselors and social workers, and that number would clearly be higher based on the reports and narratives that people provide. There's just simply not enough counselors, social workers, and mental health folks with the right certifications to be in schools that schools need. So that's a follow-on consequence of now we've identified a need for student mental health and well-being. We have resources to deploy. We don't have a workforce to meet the need. And so that's a long-term challenge for the state. I thought you also might find it interesting because we do have information from 2021 of what districts budgeted prior to the reduction by the legislature. And so this chart's kind of interesting because it basically says, their original ways that people thought they would plan to spend their funds, and then what they did. And the biggest shift is not a shocking surprise, which is you saw basically from a percentage standpoint, the more money moved towards health and safety than was originally planned. So even though the reduction came down, districts tended to shift, and that made sense because this was money that they had on hand at the time as COVID was emerging, even ahead of where ESSER funding would come. So it makes sense that that'd be a place that people would have pulled on at that moment in time. Okay. As we think about where dollars are going, we want to start thinking about, so how do you know if those dollars do anything? It's one thing to know where people spend their money, but how do we know if where they're spending actually makes a difference? Whoops. And so part of what we launched in the integrated guidance and the work behind the scenes with the office has been to get really clear about how do we actually think, what's a framework by which we understand how we're improving outcomes and learning conditions. And we've communicated publicly about values that will guide that process. Chief amongst them, the idea that monitoring and evaluation is central to learning. There is not a high-performing educational system in the world that does not have features of meaningful monitoring and evaluation and something called knowledge mobilization, which is where knowledge about how to solve a problem in the field arises, how quickly it spreads, and other people pick up that innovation. And so one of the core responsibilities we have, I believe, with these resources is to build the architecture that hasn't existed to not just organically, but systemically be able to identify where we're learning and improving, what it is to have an impact, but also to understand how change happens in systems. We'll talk in a minute about these big longitudinal growth targets. They are slow to move, and they're not the only indicators of a healthy system. So how do we come to think about the earlier signs of progress of change in the system and make sure that we don't make a mistake and turn our gaze right at the time we're making progress because we don't understand how change in the system works? This is a picture from that integrated guidance where we look at the totality of these different evaluation measures together. So longitudinal growth, performance growth targets are built in statute into the student investment account. but they are mirrored almost exactly with the exception of third grade reading and high school success. They are also very, very similar to the state's CTE Perkins performance targets. From those top three, the next set become a bit more variable, but they're tools for how we begin to build a framework to think about how and whether we are making progress. Those growth targets are something that we provide in way more detail than I'm sharing with you, tremendous technical information to districts about how to set them. They were suspended during the legislature's reduction of funding. So they are now back on, and we are trying to teach districts how to set realistic and ambitious growth targets in the areas of third grade reading, ninth grade on track, regular attendance, on-time graduation, 5-year completion, but also to encourage their innovation in what are known as local optional metrics, because we basically are in the position where we're allowed to incentivize districts to not just say, the state is telling me that I'm going to be judged by this performance, but we also are making these other significant investments. Let's talk about fourth grade emerging bilingual student performance, and knowing that fourth grade literacy and bilingual performance is a much better measure for bilingual students than third grade reading. So maybe we want to look at that. Or a district put a ton of emphasis on school culture and climate, and they have tools that look at school culture and climate that they want to be judged by. These laws allow for that. We have to build the system, and so that's a lot of the work that we're doing to get a richer picture. And that's all really important because evaluating these types of investments in systems is hard. We struggle with, unlike like a factory environment or a more controlled environment where you have lots of inputs in a system, change of superintendent, change of school board, change of curriculum, ODE investment in a program. There are a lot of things. How do you know which causes what? So in an open system, how do you know what's happening? How do we measure things that did not happen and not just what did happen? There's a lot of emerging information in a complex system that we've tended to kind of leave out of the grid. How do we bring it into the grid? And so from an implementation science standpoint, we really want to bring in tools that help us do that. Being smart about where we evaluate and knowing what type of evaluation is helpful in the early developmental side versus like a formal external evaluation of impact. Those have very different time and space opportunities. And then when we're looking at what we call working in insecure situations, which is when you're in upheaval, that's a difficult time to determine if something is useful or not. One of the frameworks that we've used in the office is a framework called outcome mapping. Outcome mapping comes from Canada's Center on International Research, mostly working in community and economic development, but can help us think about a way to notice changes that happen in the system prior to those big numbers moving. And so we've embedded aspects of this methodology into our quarterly and annual monitoring processes. We're teaching education service districts about these frameworks. We're not trying to teach the whole state this monitoring methodology, but we're embedding it so that internally we're getting smarter and wiser and can provide much more robust updates to business leaders, the legislature, and the general public about how we're seeing change unfold in the system over time ahead of where we would see something like a third grade reading number move. This slide gives you a little unpacking transparently of some of the work we've done with that. We've held several workshops, and we've embedded particularly progress markers into the framework of our grant agreements and into the methodology of how we're looking at district performance. And as we get into the integrated guidance with full funding, these 6 programs aligned, this level of planning with one methodology, we will be able to provide much, much more clarity around what we're accomplishing with this totality of resources. Okay, so by January, we'll begin to be able to look across these initiatives and have a much stronger view of even just in terms of what districts' plans are. When we review applications and budgets by next June, we'll know not just what districts are planning to do with all 6 of these programs and their funds, but what their goals and outcomes and strategies are, and a much clearer picture about the framework that we've set in terms of these growth targets. A huge amount of things are possible in this state over the next 5 years. And, you know, if you study educational change, you'll know that most change theorists say it take about a decade to move a whole system. There are only a few examples of that: Hong Kong, Ontario, core districts in California. My biggest concern / hope is that I don't think that many folks know how much has been done behind the scenes, not just by my office, but by ESDs, by districts, to implement these laws with a lot of fidelity. And that amidst COVID, we're going to come out of COVID and we have a built-in framework to help us help community and students and educators imagine forward. And the worry, and as presented in the Secretary of State's report, is that we will get caught wanting to come up with a next set of initiatives rather than stay deep in implementation in a way that will unwind something that we've made a big bet on. And so hopefully this gives you a little bit of a window into that. While maybe not a familiar quote, I will end here and then take your questions. Talking about water will not make the lips wet. A skillful discourse on fire will not make the lips hot. Unless one experiences real water and fire, one cannot know them. We may write books to explain it, but that's far from being enough. One cannot feel satisfied from mere explanation. Takuan Soho, who's a Zen priest. But I share this just because I understand that as much as I have just thrown at you, it doesn't make up for the sensation of getting to be in community, hear the kids, hear the counselor, hear the school leader say these resources are making a difference, or to know that. So hopefully I've done a decent job giving you that like under the hood experience. And again, Morgan will share this slide deck with you. I've already given her a PDF of it, and it provides links to all of the resources, including the integrated guidance that I've covered. And so with that, I will pause and we will open it up for questions and dialogue.
Thank you, Scott, so much. This was really interesting, and I hope everyone else found it as such. So if you have questions, please remember to submit them in the Q&A. Happy to relay. I do have one to get you kicked off. So as we've seen through COVID with the Student Success Act, the projected revenues really took a turn for the worse, and then now all of a sudden they've gone through the roof, and we potentially have so much more money than what we may even know what to do with to help all of our students. So I guess the question comes, do you see, or has anyone started talking about, would there be a way, are you guys looking at changing some of the revenues to maximize efficiency, like through other programs, not just through K-12 ODE, but through some of your other partner agencies to maximize efficiency?
I'm going to ask a couple questions to make sure I understand. So, because I think,
you know, are you guys anticipating or seeing, like, would higher ed potentially get some of the CAP funds, or early learning, or because they're now projecting so much extra revenue?
I understand. So I'll say a little bit, and then I welcome my colleagues if they have information about this and feel like they can share it. So I would say a couple things in mind. So one, in terms of the last, I have to go do some homework to pull this for you, but you know, we are seeing the CAT revenue be solid, and thank you, business community, 3 times over. And it is now outpacing its downgraded projections. But to be clear, if you look at what the original CAT forecast was and what was designed in for these programs, we are below that. We are making good progress towards it, but we're below that. So, right, you set the original projection level, and then COVID comes, huge decline. We are now significantly beating the decline projections, but while we're beating them, we're not actually up at the level we originally projected, right? So there's not, from my perspective, we're only close to even living into the promise of what was imagined. It is not my role to speak to higher ed or ways in which the legislature might think about other ways they would divvy out the CAT tax. I can only say that I hope we will be very careful with that idea, because as we're all aware, economies go up and down. And I think it'd be a little premature to do that, but again, that's not my role. Zoe popped on, so she might offer more.
Just a small addition here, just a reminder that the Student Success Act really came out of the work of a legislative committee that traveled around the state and assessed needs and came up with this piece of legislation, and really focused on K-12 education. And in that session, when the legislation passed, there was, I think, a feeling among many that, where is this for higher ed? This year, the legislature does have a committee that is going around and going to institutions of higher education and looking for funding sources and policy solutions in that area. So I can't speak to what those solutions might be, but I can say that work that looks similar to what happened in the SSA is occurring now with the legislature.
Thank you. Another question that we had for you is, so as you guys are a couple of years into this now and you're starting to see some of the programs come to fruition, what are some of the areas that you think you've seen, or the types of programs that you've seen the most success in so far for the outcomes that they've wanted?
I can take that. I think I'll speak specifically to SI and high school success. I think that Tamara, if you want to offer anything on the other 28 programs, I would say that for the SIA, one of the single most significant accomplishments has been the quality of community engagement and what that has meant in terms of better informed planning. I'm humbled by this comment, but leaders who work with students experiencing disability said that for many students experiencing disabilities and their family, it was the first time since the passage of IDEA that they have felt listened to and that they belonged in the planning process. And that is no small feat, which means that you have like a federal law, but it didn't come to life until the focal student engagement expectation of districts came to bear, and districts were asked to meet a high level expectation. And we've heard versions of that from emerging bilingual students, students experiencing poverty, and we've heard district leaders go, this was hard, but this fundamentally changes how we understand school. So I think that's hard to calibrate in terms of what does that mean, but it was, and all that played out ahead of COVID, and many leaders shared with us that the work that they had done to build connection and relationship and community benefited their ability to respond for COVID-19. So I think that that's not an insignificant thing. In terms of excellence, I think you've seen some districts work really hard to implement robust literacy strategies, some that had them prior, some that didn't forward. I think that there's such an array of what people have invested in, but there's definitely work on both restorative justice programs, but also just basic student health and well-being processes. We're going from like a bare bones situation, one half-time assistant principal with no counseling background, working in a school with 600 high school students, and they now have two full-time counselors with caseloads of a couple hundred kids. That's still not great by level of standard, but that means kids are having an opportunity to have someone meaningfully listen to them with expertise. Again, hard to kind of quantify in terms of this is the magic bullet that does that. We certainly have a lot of examples with high school success where that investment, which to be clear, the CAT tax fully funds high school success. High school success was half funded, and the CAT tax and SSA fully funds that program, which has allowed us to be able to have a higher level of clarity for districts about meeting their requirements under high school success. We have seen, and I almost put this slide in there, we've seen a huge increase in the quality of CTE programs of study. We have seen work with equitable course assignment. So what kids get AP and IB classes, and looking at an analysis of who gets assigned. We've seen significant improvement up until the pandemic on 9th grade on track. And that's because people have implemented 9th grade on track programs. Work at Northwest Regional ESD and those districts is probably the most standout as it relates to network school improvement for 9th grade on track leaders. Hopefully that gives you a little flavor, but happy to follow up with more details.
One last question for you. So as you guys are finalizing the initial implementation and finishing your accountability metrics and internally your system, can you remind us how you guys are supposed to, or what is the requirement to get back to the legislature on the accountability and general updates of how the Student Success Act and CAP funds are being used and implemented?
Great question. So one of the links that I provided, I'll put in the chat as well, is the most recent update on the student investment account implementation as an example. Tamara can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly confident that if not almost every initiative in SSA completed a version of this same report. What tends to happen is that those reports get submitted, but unless a busy legislature affords it a hearing, they can go a little bit under the radar, despite the fact that staff's putting a lot of work into updating them. So there is a robust array of reports on implementation for each of the SSA initiatives. Again, it looks like Tamara might say more about that. And I believe we're in every other year calendar cycle for like a formal report. And then, of course, where we're invited by legislators to offer hearings or, that we might give some type of presentation on a more regular basis. But Tamara, what would you add?
You're correct. So some of the other areas of the Student Success Act, namely the targeted student success plans for such as African American, Black students, American Indian, Alaska Native, LGBT to SIA+, do require legislative reports. Some of the other areas had an initial legislative report required, which we did complete, but do not require ongoing reports, though we will be reporting on them as part of our budget process each long session with the Joint Ways and Means Ed Subcommittee.
Great, thank you so much. Well, Scott and team, thank you for your time this afternoon. This was very interesting and very helpful for us and our members. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. And if anyone has additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can relay them to the ODE staff. And I'm sure we will be talking quite regularly in the future as we all go down this journey together. So appreciate your time. And this recording will be up on our website later. For those who are interested, our next webinar is on July 14th on the new Paid Leave Oregon program. So sign up for that if you would like. Otherwise, have a great rest of your evening. And thank you so much for joining us today.